Imagine waking up each morning knowing that the day ahead would require you to endure hours of pain, to apply toxic substances to your skin, to bind your body in ways that restricted your breathing, and to follow beauty rules so strict that failure to comply could mean social ruin, mockery, or even accusations of witchcraft. In the medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century across Europe, beauty was not a choice or a personal expression, but rather a rigid set of expectations that governed every aspect of a person's appearance, from the color of their skin to the shape of their hairline, from the width of their forehead to the plumpness of their lips. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the most brutal, shocking, and often dangerous beauty practices that medieval men and women endured in their quest to meet the impossible standards of their time. Standards that were dictated by religion, reinforced by social class, and maintained through practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. This is not a story of simple vanity or harmless cosmetics, but rather a deep exploration of how beauty ideals could control lives, cause suffering, and reflect the deepest values and fears of medieval society, where appearance was believed to reflect the soul, where physical beauty was thought to indicate moral goodness, and where ugliness was associated with sin, evil, and damnation. As you settle into this long night's journey through the painful world of medieval beauty standards, you will discover the toxic ingredients that were rubbed into skin, the binding garments that deformed bodies, the hair removal techniques that caused permanent damage, the teeth whitening methods that destroyed enamel, the bloodletting rituals performed in the name of a pale complexion, and the countless other practices that medieval people accepted as normal, necessary, and even desirable in their endless pursuit of an ideal that was as unattainable as it was unforgiving. Chapter 1: The Foundation of Medieval Beauty Standards. To understand why medieval beauty standards were so brutal and unforgiving, we must first understand the worldview that created them, a worldview shaped by Christianity, feudal social structures, and ancient medical theories that together formed a system of belief about the human body, its appearance, and its meaning. Medieval Europeans inherited beauty ideals from classical antiquity, particularly from Roman and Greek traditions, but they transformed these ideals through the lens of Christian theology, which taught that the body was a temple that could be either honored or defiled, that physical appearance reflected spiritual condition, and that maintaining proper appearance was not vanity but rather a duty to God and society. The concept of beauty in medieval Europe was inseparable from ideas about purity, nobility, and divine favor, with beautiful people believed to be closer to God's image and ugly people thought to bear the marks of sin or demonic influence. This belief system meant that pursuing beauty was not merely about personal attractiveness, but about demonstrating one's virtue, social status, and worthiness in the eyes of both God and the community. The medieval beauty ideal centered on a pale, almost translucent complexion that showed blue veins beneath the skin, a feature that indicated noble birth and freedom from outdoor labor, as only peasants who worked in the fields would have tanned or weathered skin. A high, broad forehead was considered essential for beauty, with the ideal forehead extending far back from the eyebrows and hairline, creating an egg-shaped face that was thought to resemble the face of the Virgin Mary and other holy figures depicted in religious art. Small, rosebud lips were preferred over full mouths, with the ideal lips being just barely visible and naturally pink rather than red, as red lips were associated with excessive passion and sexual availability. Eyes should be large and widely spaced, preferably blue or gray rather than brown, as darker eyes were considered too passionate and possibly indicating foreign blood. The nose should be small, straight, and delicate, with any deviation from this ideal being seen as a flaw that detracted from overall beauty. Hair color preferences varied somewhat by region and period, but generally fair hair ranging from golden blonde to light brown was most prized, with red hair being viewed with suspicion as a possible mark of witchcraft or devilish influence, and very dark hair being associated with foreigners or lower classes. Body shape ideals differed significantly from modern preferences, with medieval beauty standards favoring a slender but soft figure, not muscular or athletic, with small breasts, narrow hips, and a slightly rounded belly that was thought to indicate fertility without excessive sensuality. Height preferences varied, but generally women should be neither too tall nor too short, with moderate stature being most desirable, and men should be tall but not giant-like, as extreme height might indicate abnormality. Hands should be small with long, tapering fingers and pale skin, unmarked by calluses or spots, with nails kept short and clean but not elaborately decorated. Feet, when visible, should also be small and delicate, with large feet being considered vulgar and unfeminine. Overall, the medieval beauty ideal emphasized refinement, delicacy, and markers of high social status, with any feature that suggested manual labor, outdoor exposure, or peasant origins being considered ugly regardless of other attractive qualities the person might possess. The social consequences of failing to meet these beauty standards were severe and far-reaching, affecting marriage prospects, social opportunities, and even physical safety in a society that believed appearance reflected character. Beautiful people, particularly beautiful women, were assumed to be virtuous, intelligent, and worthy of respect, while ugly people faced suspicion, mockery, and discrimination. In marriage negotiations, which were economic and political arrangements rather than romantic unions, a woman's beauty could significantly increase her family's ability to negotiate favorable terms, while an ugly daughter might require a larger dowry to compensate for her lack of attractiveness. Men also faced pressure to meet beauty standards, though with somewhat different emphases, as male beauty ideals focused more on signs of strength, vigor, and noble bearing rather than the delicate features prized in women. However, men too needed to display pale skin if they were of noble birth, needed to maintain clean and properly styled hair, and needed to dress in ways that demonstrated their social status, making beauty and grooming important for both sexes, though the specific requirements and the severity of consequences for failure differed along gender lines. Chapter 2: The Dangerous Pursuit of Pale Skin. The most fundamental requirement of medieval beauty was pale skin, a complexion so white that it appeared almost translucent, showing the delicate blue tracery of veins beneath the surface and creating an ethereal quality that was thought to resemble angels, saints, and the Virgin Mary herself. This obsession with pale skin was not purely aesthetic but deeply connected to social class, as only wealthy people who never needed to work outdoors could maintain such a complexion, while peasants and laborers inevitably developed tanned, weathered skin from exposure to sun and wind. To achieve and maintain this prized paleness, medieval people turned to a variety of cosmetic treatments that ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely dangerous, applying substances to their faces and bodies that we now know were toxic, corrosive, and sometimes deadly, yet which were considered essential beauty aids by those desperate to meet the unforgiving standards of their time. The most notorious skin whitening agent used in medieval Europe was white lead, also called ceruse, a powder made from lead carbonate that could be mixed with vinegar or water to create a paste that was applied thickly to the face, neck, and chest. This white lead paste provided an opaque, brilliant white surface that covered blemishes, spots, and any hint of natural color, creating the ghostly pale complexion that was so highly desired. Women and sometimes men would apply this paste daily, building up layers that created a mask-like appearance, smooth and white, but also stiff and prone to cracking if the wearer smiled or made exaggerated facial expressions. The lead in this cosmetic was highly toxic, slowly poisoning users through absorption into the skin and through accidental ingestion when the paste flaked off, or when users touched their treated faces and then ate food without washing their hands. Long-term use of white lead cosmetics caused a horrifying array of health problems including hair loss, muscle paralysis, insanity, kidney failure, and death, with many medieval beauties literally poisoning themselves to death in their pursuit of pale skin. Other skin whitening substances were scarcely less dangerous, including mercury compounds that were rubbed into the skin or taken internally as tonics, arsenic powders that were applied to the face, and various concoctions containing sulfur, alum, and other harsh chemicals that stripped away the outer layers of skin to reveal paler tissue beneath. Some recipes called for the application of crushed pearls mixed with lemon juice, a treatment that was expensive but at least less toxic than lead or mercury. Egg whites were beaten until frothy and applied to the skin as a tightening mask that temporarily made the skin appear smoother and paler. Milk, particularly ass's milk or goat's milk, was used as a skin wash, with some wealthy women taking full milk baths in imitation of the legendary Cleopatra, believing that milk would whiten and soften the skin. Vinegar was applied as an astringent, tightening pores and supposedly whitening the complexion, though its acidic nature could cause irritation and damage to sensitive skin. Beyond topical applications, medieval people pursued pale skin through more invasive methods, including bloodletting, a medical practice that involved deliberately removing blood from the body through cutting a vein or applying leeches. Bloodletting was believed to balance the body's humors according to medieval medical theory, but it was also used as a beauty treatment because removing blood from the body would temporarily make the skin appear paler due to reduced blood flow to the surface. Women would have blood removed from veins in their arms or feet, sometimes removing dangerous amounts of blood in their quest for a few days of enhanced paleness. This practice weakened the body, caused anemia, and in some cases led to death from blood loss or infection, yet it remained popular among fashionable women throughout much of the medieval period. Some women went even further, deliberately avoiding nutritious food to maintain a weak, pale appearance, essentially starving themselves to achieve the translucent quality that was so admired, a practice that caused malnutrition, weakened bones, and increased susceptibility to disease. The psychological impact of the pale skin obsession was profound, creating anxiety and shame for those who could not maintain the ideal complexion, whether due to natural coloring, sun exposure, or lack of access to expensive whitening cosmetics. Women with naturally olive or tanned complexions faced discrimination and mockery, being told they looked like peasants or foreigners regardless of their actual social status. The constant application of toxic cosmetics required hours of daily preparation, with wealthy women rising early to apply their white lead paste, waiting for it to dry, and then carefully maintaining it throughout the day, repairing cracks and reapplying as needed. This routine was time-consuming, uncomfortable, and ultimately harmful, yet refusing to follow it meant social isolation and reduced marriage prospects, creating a system where women had little choice but to participate in their own poisoning if they wished to maintain their place in society. Chapter 3: The Torture of Hair Removal and Modification. Medieval beauty standards demanded that visible body hair be minimal or absent entirely, particularly for women, whose smooth, hairless skin was considered a mark of refinement and femininity, while excessive body hair was thought to indicate a bestial nature or even demonic possession in extreme cases. However, medieval people lacked modern tools like razors, waxing strips, or laser treatments, forcing them to resort to painful, dangerous, and often ineffective methods to remove unwanted hair from their bodies. The obsession with hair removal extended beyond the obvious areas to include eyebrows, which were often completely removed or severely thinned, and the hairline, which was plucked back several inches to create the desired high forehead that was central to medieval beauty ideals. The most common hair removal method was plucking, using tweezers made of metal or sometimes sharpened bone to pull out individual hairs one by one, a process that was extraordinarily time-consuming and painful, causing inflammation, infection, and sometimes permanent scarring. Women would spend hours plucking hair from their eyebrows, their hairline, and sometimes their entire forehead to push back the hair growth and create the fashionable high, broad forehead shape. This repeated trauma to the hair follicles sometimes succeeded in permanently preventing hair regrowth in the plucked areas, but it also frequently led to infections as bacteria entered the damaged follicles, causing abscesses, scarring, and sometimes more serious infections that could spread if left untreated. The pain of plucking such sensitive areas as the eyebrows and hairline was intense, yet medieval women were expected to endure it without complaint, as complaining about beauty routines was seen as unfeminine and weak. Chemical depilatories were also used, though the medieval formulations were harsh and dangerous, containing ingredients like quicklime, arsenic, and other caustic substances that literally burned away hair along with the top layers of skin. These depilatories were mixed into pastes and applied to areas where hair removal was desired, left on until the skin began to burn intensely, and then scraped or washed off, hopefully removing the hair in the process. The results were unpredictable, with some applications removing hair effectively, while others caused severe chemical burns, scarring, and permanent skin damage. Medieval beauty manuals contain recipes for these depilatories with warnings about their dangerous nature, yet they continued to be used because the social pressure to have smooth, hairless skin was so intense that women were willing to risk permanent disfigurement rather than appear with visible body hair. One particularly brutal hair removal method involved the use of hot wax or resin, similar in concept to modern waxing but far more primitive and dangerous in execution. The wax or resin would be heated until liquid, applied to the skin while still very hot, causing burns and blistering, and then ripped off once it cooled, tearing out hair along with pieces of skin. This method was agonizingly painful and often caused significant skin damage, bleeding, and infection, yet it was used by those desperate to remove larger areas of hair more quickly than plucking would allow. Some women turned to threads or strings that were twisted and pulled across the skin to catch and remove multiple hairs at once, a technique that was less damaging than chemical depilatories, but still painful and time-consuming. The modification of head hair was equally demanding and potentially harmful, with medieval beauty standards requiring women to arrange their hair in elaborate styles that reflected their social status while also conforming to religious requirements about modesty. Married women were expected to cover their hair completely in public, wearing various forms of veils, hoods, and headdresses that concealed every strand, as exposed hair on a married woman was considered immodest and sexually provocative. However, even when hair was to be covered, it still needed to be properly prepared, requiring washing, combing, and arranging in ways that prevented tangles and maintained the health and beauty of the hair for those intimate moments when it would be uncovered for a husband. Unmarried women had somewhat more freedom to display their hair, but it still needed to conform to standards of neatness, color, and style that indicated virtue and proper upbringing. Achieving the ideal hair color often required chemical treatments that were damaging and sometimes dangerous, with blonde hair being particularly prized in many regions and periods, leading women with darker hair to attempt lightening treatments. Medieval hair bleaching methods involved sitting in the sun for hours with various substances applied to the hair, including sulfur powder, saffron, honey mixed with lye, and other concoctions that ranged from merely ineffective to actively harmful. The sulfur treatments gave off noxious fumes and caused headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems, while the lye-based treatments could burn the scalp and cause hair breakage and loss. Some women wore special hats with no crown that allowed their hair to be spread across the wide brim and exposed to maximum sunlight while protecting their faces, sitting for hours in uncomfortable positions as they slowly bleached their hair strand by strand. The process of maintaining long hair, which was the ideal for women throughout most of the medieval period, required significant effort and discomfort, as medieval people lacked modern shampoos and conditioners, instead washing their hair infrequently with harsh soaps made from animal fats and lye, or with various herbal infusions that were less damaging but also less effective at removing oils and dirt. Infrequent washing meant that hair often became dirty and tangled, requiring painful combing sessions to remove knots and lice, which were nearly universal afflictions in medieval times regardless of social class. The combs themselves were often made of wood or bone with teeth that were wide-spaced and relatively gentle, but removing severe tangles still caused pain and hair breakage, and the presence of lice meant that combing was often accompanied by the application of various oils and herbs meant to kill or repel the parasites, though these treatments were rarely fully effective. Chapter 4: The dangerous obsession with small waists and bound bodies. Medieval fashion evolved significantly over the centuries, but one consistent element, particularly in the later medieval period, was the emphasis on a small waist and a specific body silhouette that could only be achieved through the use of tightly laced garments that compressed the torso and restricted movement and breathing. While the extreme corsetry of later centuries was not yet fully developed in medieval times, the foundations were being laid, with garments designed to shape the body into an idealized form regardless of natural body shape or the physical cost to the wearer. These garments were not merely uncomfortable clothing, but rather instruments of body modification that, when worn consistently from a young age, could permanently alter the shape of the ribcage and internal organs, causing health problems that lasted throughout a person's life. The medieval version of body-shaping undergarments included various forms of tightly fitted tunics, kirtles, and later, the development of more structured bodices that incorporated stiffening elements like whalebone, wood, or stiffened fabric to create a rigid shape that would not flex with the body's movements. These garments were laced extremely tightly, often requiring assistance to put on and remove, and once laced, they severely restricted the wearer's ability to bend, twist, or breathe deeply. Women wearing these garments had to move carefully and deliberately, unable to perform many physical tasks and prone to fainting if they exerted themselves or became overheated, as the compression of their torsos made deep breathing impossible and reduced their lung capacity significantly. The fashionable silhouette required the waist to be as small as possible, with the ideal being a waist that a man could encircle with his hands, a standard that required such extreme lacing that some women suffered from broken ribs, displaced organs, and digestive problems caused by the constant compression of their abdomens. Young girls of noble families were often placed in these restrictive garments as soon as they reached an age where their bodies began developing, with the intention of training their bodies to grow into the desired shape, much as the later practice of corsetry would more explicitly aim to mold the body from childhood. This early introduction to body binding meant that girls grew up never knowing what it felt like to move freely or breathe deeply, accepting the constant discomfort and restriction as normal and necessary for a woman of quality. The physical effects of long-term wearing of these garments were severe, including chronic back pain from the unnatural posture required to maintain balance while wearing rigid bodices, weakened core muscles that atrophied from lack of use as the garment did the work of holding the body upright, and compression of the internal organs that could lead to digestive problems, liver damage, and reproductive difficulties. Beyond the internal health effects, the tight lacing of medieval garments caused visible damage to the body, leaving deep indentations in the skin that could become permanent grooves in the flesh, causing chafing and sores where the garment's edges pressed most tightly against the body, and creating a dependency where the wearer felt unable to maintain posture or support their body without the artificial assistance of the garment. Women who wore tightly laced bodices for years developed characteristic shapes, with ribs that curved inward at the bottom where they had been pressed by the garment, waists that were narrowed beyond their natural shape, and digestive systems that had adapted to functioning in a compressed space. The removal of these garments after long wear was itself a painful and difficult process, as the body had to readjust to functioning without external support and women often experienced lightheadedness, muscle pain, and feelings of instability when they removed their stays. The social pressure to maintain a small waist was intense, with larger women facing mockery and difficulty in finding suitable marriage partners, as a thick waist was seen as indicating gluttony, laziness, or low birth. This pressure led some women to extreme measures, including drastically reducing their food intake to minimize waist size, wearing their garments laced even tighter than was already standard, and enduring pain and health problems rather than loosening their laces and revealing that their natural waist was larger than the fashionable ideal. Pregnancy presented particular problems, as medieval fashion did not accommodate expanding bodies, requiring pregnant women to either retire from society for the duration of their pregnancy or to continue wearing restrictive garments modified only slightly to allow for their changing shape, a practice that was uncomfortable for the mother and potentially dangerous for the developing child. Men's fashion also included elements of body restriction, though generally less extreme than women's garments, with doublets and hose that were meant to fit very snugly, displaying the shape of the legs and torso and requiring a reasonably fit physique to wear fashionably. Men who were too thin or too heavy faced ridicule and struggled to find clothing that fit properly, as medieval tailoring was not designed to accommodate variations from the ideal body type. Men's hose, which covered each leg separately and were tied to the doublet, needed to be very tightly fitted to avoid sagging or wrinkling, which was considered slovenly, yet this tightness restricted movement and could cause chafing and discomfort, particularly for men who needed to ride horses or perform other physical activities while maintaining a fashionable appearance. Codpieces, which became popular in the later medieval period, added another element of discomfort and artificiality, requiring careful positioning and maintenance to create the desired impression of masculine virility while actually being uncomfortable and sometimes painful to wear. Chapter 5: The Agony of Dental Beauty and Mouth Modification. Medieval dental health was notoriously poor, with most people suffering from tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss by relatively young ages. Yet beauty standards still demanded a pleasant smile with white teeth and fresh breath, creating a painful contradiction between ideal and reality. The medieval diet, high in bread and other grain products that wore down tooth enamel, combined with a lack of effective oral hygiene practices and limited understanding of dental health, meant that dental problems were nearly universal, affecting rich and poor alike, though the wealthy had access to painful and often harmful treatments that the poor could not afford. The pursuit of white teeth and attractive smile led medieval people to employ various substances and techniques that ranged from the ineffective to the actively destructive, causing pain, permanent damage, and sometimes death from infection or poisoning. Teeth whitening in the medieval period relied on abrasive substances that would scrub away stains along with tooth enamel, gradually wearing down the protective surface of the teeth and making them more vulnerable to decay even as they temporarily appeared whiter. Common teeth cleaning powders included mixtures of pumice stone, brick dust, crushed seashells, and various herbs, which were rubbed onto the teeth with fingers or cloth, creating a scrubbing action that removed surface stains but also abraded the enamel. Some formulations included honey or sugar to make them more palatable, ironically adding cavity-causing substances to a product meant to improve dental health. More aggressive treatments involved the use of acids, including vinegar and urine, which were swished in the mouth to dissolve stains and kill bacteria, but which also dissolved tooth enamel and caused sensitivity and decay. One particularly harmful practice involved rubbing the teeth with a cloth dipped in aqua fortis, a solution of nitric acid, which did indeed whiten teeth dramatically but also destroyed enamel and could cause chemical burns to the gums and mouth. Fresh breath was considered essential for beauty and social interaction, yet maintaining it was difficult in an era before toothpaste, mouthwash, or proper dental care, when tooth decay, gum disease, and digestive problems all contributed to chronic bad breath that could mark a person as unclean or unhealthy. To combat halitosis, medieval people chewed various herbs and spices, including mint, anise, fennel, and cloves, which temporarily masked unpleasant odors but did nothing to address the underlying dental problems causing the bad breath. Some people used mouthwashes made from wine mixed with herbs, or from rose water, or from solutions containing alum and other astringent substances meant to tighten the gums and reduce inflammation. In extreme cases, people would have rotten teeth pulled, a procedure performed without anesthesia by barber surgeons or sometimes by any person willing to attempt it, using primitive pliers or forceps to grasp the tooth and pull with as much force as necessary to extract it, often breaking the tooth in the process and leaving fragments embedded in the gum that would cause ongoing infections. The pain of dental problems in medieval times was severe and often chronic, with toothaches being one of the most common and most dreaded afflictions, capable of causing such agony that sufferers were willing to try any remedy, no matter how bizarre or unpleasant. Treatments for toothache included holding hot coals near the affected area to draw out the pain, applying poultices made from animal dung, inserting insects into the ear on the affected side based on the belief that earwigs would consume the source of pain, and wearing amulets or charms blessed by priests or containing holy relics. More rational treatments involved applying clove oil, which does have genuine analgesic properties, or using willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, but even these more effective remedies could only dull the pain rather than cure the underlying infection or decay causing it. The loss of teeth, which was common and often began in a person's 20s or 30s, was devastating not only for eating but also for appearance, as missing teeth created a sunken, aged appearance and made speech difficult. Some wealthy individuals attempted to replace lost teeth with artificial ones made from bone or ivory, or even with teeth pulled from corpses or purchased from living donors who sold their healthy teeth for money, a practice that reveals the desperation both of those who needed replacement teeth and those poor enough to sell their own. These replacement teeth were attached to remaining natural teeth with wire or silk thread, creating a crude prosthetic that was uncomfortable, unstable, and prone to infection where the foreign material contacted the gum tissue. The transplanted teeth from other people sometimes took hold initially, connecting to the new owner's jaw, but they eventually failed and began to decay, often causing worse problems than the original tooth loss. The social impact of dental problems was significant, with people suffering from toothaches or missing teeth avoiding social situations, covering their mouths when speaking, and refraining from smiling to hide their dental defects. Bad breath was grounds for social rejection, with people recoiling from those who suffered from it and attributing the odor to moral failings or spiritual corruption rather than recognizing it as a health problem. The inability to eat certain foods due to missing or painful teeth affected nutrition and health, creating a downward spiral where poor dental health led to poor overall health, which further damaged teeth and gums. Yet despite the prevalence of dental problems, medieval beauty standards continued to idealize perfect white teeth and fresh breath, creating yet another impossible standard that added to the physical and psychological burdens borne by medieval people in their pursuit of beauty. Chapter 6: The painful practice of foot binding and restrictive footwear. While the extreme practice of Chinese foot binding was not part of European medieval culture, medieval Europeans had their own painful foot practices driven by fashion and status symbolism, particularly the wearing of extremely impractical footwear that caused deformity, pain, and disability in the name of beauty and social standing. Medieval shoes evolved from practical leather coverings to elongated, pointed styles called polanes or cracos that extended far beyond the toes, sometimes reaching lengths of 2 feet or more for the most extreme examples worn by wealthy nobles. These elongated shoes were not merely uncomfortable but actively harmful, forcing the toes to curl unnaturally within the shoe, causing bunions, hammer toes, and other deformities, while making normal walking difficult and running or other vigorous activity nearly impossible. The fashion for pointed shoes with extremely long toes began in the 14th century and reached its peak in the 15th century, with the length of the toe becoming a status symbol, as only those who did not need to perform manual labor or walk long distances could afford to wear such impractical footwear. The points of the most extreme shoes had to be stuffed with moss, wool, or other materials to maintain their shape, and sometimes they were so long that they needed to be tied up to the wearer's knees with chains or ribbons to prevent tripping. Clergy condemned these shoes as sinful vanities, with some church officials declaring that the points were actually designed to represent demons' talons, and that wearing them was tantamount to devil worship. Yet the fashion persisted among the nobility, who saw the shoes as essential markers of their high status and their freedom from the need to perform practical activities. Women's shoes were generally less dramatically elongated than men's, but presented their own challenges, with fashionable women wearing shoes that were designed more for appearance than function, made from delicate materials like silk or soft leather that provided little support or protection, with thin soles that offered no cushioning against hard medieval streets and floors. The combination of delicate shoes and the restrictive garments discussed earlier meant that fashionable medieval women could barely walk, needing to take small, careful steps and often requiring assistance to navigate stairs or uneven ground. This enforced helplessness was actually considered desirable, as it demonstrated that the woman was of such high status that she need not move quickly or independently, and it reinforced gender roles that positioned women as delicate, dependent creatures in need of male protection and guidance. Patterns, a type of overshoe worn outdoors to protect delicate indoor shoes from mud and dirt, added height and further instability to a person's gait, raising the wearer several inches off the ground on platforms or stilts that made walking treacherous, particularly on wet or slippery surfaces. These overshoes served a practical purpose in keeping expensive shoes clean, but the height they added became yet another status symbol, with wealthy people wearing increasingly tall patterns to demonstrate their importance and to quite literally look down on those of lower status. The physical difficulty of walking in tall patterns, combined with restrictive garments and impractical shoes, meant that fashionable people moved through the world in a state of constant physical handicap, their mobility severely limited by the requirements of fashion. The health consequences of wearing these impractical shoes throughout life were significant and permanent, with older people who had spent decades wearing pointed shoes or tall patterns suffering from deformed feet, damaged joints, and chronic pain that made walking difficult even when they finally abandoned fashion for more practical footwear. The toes that had been forced to curl within pointed shoes often could not straighten again, remaining in a cramped, clawed position that made barefoot walking painful. The unnatural gait required to walk in elongated shoes or tall patterns stressed the knees, hips, and lower back, causing joint problems and arthritis that worsened with age. Women who had spent their lives taking tiny, restricted steps in impractical shoes often found that their leg muscles had atrophied and they lacked the strength and flexibility to walk normally even when given the opportunity, making them permanently dependent on assistance for mobility. Children of wealthy families were introduced to fashionable footwear at young ages, their growing feet shaped and sometimes deformed by shoes that prioritized appearance over health, a practice that reveals how completely beauty and status concerns overrode considerations of physical well-being. Parents who dressed their children in miniature versions of adult fashion were demonstrating the family's wealth and status, showing that they could afford to have children who would never need to run, play vigorously, or perform physical labor, children whose feet could be sacrificed to fashion because their future would be one of leisure and supervision rather than activity and independence. This childhood imposition of painful, restrictive footwear normalized the discomfort and taught young people that suffering for appearance was natural, necessary, and even virtuous, preparing them to accept and perpetuate the beauty standards that would govern their adult lives. Chapter 7: The Bloodletting Beauty Ritual. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical treatments in medieval Europe, based on the theory of humors that dominated medieval medicine and held that health depended on maintaining the correct balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. However, bloodletting was not only used to treat illness, but was also employed as a beauty treatment, particularly by women seeking to achieve the pale complexion that was so essential to medieval beauty standards. The practice of deliberately removing blood from the body to appear more beautiful reveals the extreme lengths to which medieval people would go in pursuit of aesthetic ideals, willingly weakening themselves, risking infection and death, all for the sake of a temporary increase in skin pallor that would fade within days and need to be repeated regularly to maintain the desired effect. The process of bloodletting for beauty purposes typically involved making a cut in a vein, most commonly in the arm or foot, and allowing blood to flow out until a significant amount had been collected, anywhere from a few ounces to a pint or more depending on the practitioner's judgment and the client's tolerance. The procedure was performed by barber surgeons, who combined hair cutting and shaving with minor medical procedures in medieval times, or sometimes by physicians for wealthy clients who could afford more educated practitioners. The bloodletting tools were simple but effective, including lancets for making small cuts and fleams for making larger incisions, and the collected blood would drain into a bowl while the practitioner monitored the flow and watched the client for signs of excessive weakness or fainting. The immediate effects of bloodletting included a pale, one appearance as blood volume decreased and less blood flowed to the skin's surface, creating exactly the kind of ethereal, translucent look that was so prized in medieval beauty standards. However, these effects came at a terrible cost, as removing significant amounts of blood left the body weakened, dizzy, and more vulnerable to illness and infection. The loss of blood reduced the body's ability to carry oxygen to tissues and organs, causing fatigue, weakness, and in cases of excessive blood removal, potentially life-threatening anemia. The wounds created by bloodletting could become infected, particularly given medieval standards of hygiene and the common practice of reusing bloodletting tools without proper cleaning, leading to blood poisoning and potentially death from what was supposed to be a beauty treatment. Women who regularly underwent bloodletting for beauty purposes were essentially keeping themselves in a perpetual state of anemia, never allowing their bodies to fully recover between sessions and maintaining their pale appearance through chronic blood loss that left them weak, tired, and more susceptible to diseases. This weakness was actually considered attractive in medieval terms, as it reinforced the ideal of feminine delicacy and fragility, with women who were robust and healthy-looking being viewed as too masculine or too low-class. The association of weakness and pallor with beauty created a dangerous feedback loop where women would undergo bloodletting to appear weak and pale, and then would be praised for having the weak, pale appearance that indicated they were regularly undergoing bloodletting, encouraging them to continue the practice despite its harmful effects. Beyond the direct blood removal, the process of bloodletting was itself painful and frightening, particularly for those undergoing it for the first time, as watching one's own blood drain from a cut vein was a disturbing experience that could cause fainting or panic. The after effects of significant blood loss included headaches, dizziness, rapid heartbeat, and difficulty concentrating, symptoms that could last for days or even weeks if a large amount of blood had been taken. Recovery required rest and nutritious food to rebuild the lost blood volume, but medieval understanding of nutrition was limited, and many people did not have access to the iron-rich foods that would have helped their bodies recover more quickly, prolonging their weakness and making subsequent bloodletting sessions even more dangerous. The practice of bloodletting for beauty was not limited to women, though they were the primary users of this particular beauty treatment. Men sometimes underwent bloodletting to treat specific conditions or as a general health measure, and maintaining a pale complexion was also important for men of noble birth who needed to distinguish themselves from laborers and peasants. However, the social acceptance of male robustness and the fact that men's bodies were not as thoroughly scrutinized for beauty as women's bodies meant that men faced less pressure to undergo regular bloodletting for appearance sake, and they were more likely to refuse or postpone the treatment if they felt it was making them too weak to perform their duties. The medical establishment, such as it was in medieval times, actively promoted bloodletting as both a health treatment and a beauty enhancement, with physicians and medical texts recommending specific times of year, month, or even specific days for bloodletting based on astrological calculations and humoral theory. This medical endorsement gave the practice legitimacy and made it seem scientific and beneficial rather than dangerous and harmful, encouraging people to trust their bodies to practitioners whose understanding of physiology was fundamentally flawed and whose treatments were often more harmful than the conditions they were meant to address. The combination of medical authority, social pressure, and aesthetic ideals created a powerful force pushing medieval people, particularly women, toward a practice that weakened them, made them sick, and sometimes killed them, all in the name of beauty. Chapter 8: The Suffering Behind Perfect Hands and Nails. In medieval society, hands were constantly on display and were scrutinized as indicators of social status, breeding, and beauty, with particular attention paid to their size, color, texture, and the appearance of the nails. The ideal hands were small and delicate with long, tapering fingers, pale skin unmarked by spots or calluses, and short, clean nails that showed no signs of dirt or damage. Achieving and maintaining this ideal required constant vigilance and often painful treatments, particularly for those whose natural hands did not match the standard or whose daily activities threatened to mark their hands with the signs of work or outdoor exposure. The overwhelming importance placed on hand beauty meant that women of the upper classes would go to extraordinary lengths to protect their hands from any kind of damage or discoloration, wearing gloves constantly when outdoors to prevent sun exposure that might tan or freckle the skin, coating their hands in thick creams and lotions before bed and sleeping with gloved hands to allow the treatments to penetrate overnight, and avoiding any activity that might callus the skin or break a nail. This obsessive hand care routine was time-consuming and restricting, limiting what activities a woman could perform and marking her as someone who never needed to do manual work, which was precisely the point, as hands that showed no sign of labor indicated a person of high status who had servants to perform all practical tasks. For those whose hands were naturally too large, too dark, or too coarse to meet beauty standards, more aggressive treatments were needed, including the application of hand whitening creams that contained many of the same toxic ingredients used on the face, including white lead, mercury, and arsenic compounds. These hand treatments would be applied thickly and left on overnight or even for days at a time, gradually lightening the skin but also causing the same kinds of poisoning and damage that facial cosmetics caused, including skin degradation, hair loss on the hands and arms, and systemic poisoning if used long-term. Some women used mild acids to peel away the outer layers of skin, revealing newer, paler skin beneath, a process that was painful and left the hands vulnerable to infection while the skin healed. The care of fingernails was another area where medieval beauty standards created suffering, though perhaps less dramatically than some other practices. Nails needed to be kept short and clean, as long nails were associated with witchcraft and with the clawed hands of demons, and dirty nails indicated poverty and poor hygiene. However, cutting and cleaning nails with medieval tools was not the simple task it is today, as specialized nail scissors and clippers were expensive and not universally available, meaning that many people had to make do with small knives or even had to bite their nails to keep them short. The process of cleaning under the nails required sharp implements that could easily cause injury, puncturing the nail bed or cutting the sensitive skin around the nail. leading to painful infections that could make the hand swell and preventing the use of the affected hand for days or weeks. Some medieval beauty treatises recommended various treatments to improve the appearance of nails, including buffing them with soft leather to make them shine, applying oil to the cuticles to prevent drying and cracking, and avoiding certain activities that might damage or discolor the nails. However, the reality for most people, even those of relatively high status, was that nail care was minimal and nails were often damaged, discolored, or infected, creating yet another aspect of appearance where the ideal was rarely achieved and where most people lived with the knowledge that their hands did not meet beauty standards. The psychological impact of hand scrutiny was significant, with people, particularly women, developing anxiety about having their hands seen and judged, habitually hiding their hands in sleeves or gloves, and avoiding situations where their hands might be closely examined. The association of hand beauty with social status meant that having imperfect hands could mark a person as low class regardless of their actual wealth or birth, as hands were difficult to fake and showed the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of activities. A woman born to nobility but with large, red hands would face questions about her breeding, while a woman with perfect, delicate hands but from a merchant family might find her hands opening doors that her family name could not. The practice of judging people by their hands reinforced class divisions and created another axis of inequality, as those who performed manual labor inevitably developed the calloused, marked hands that indicated their lower status, while those who never worked maintained the soft, pale hands that proclaimed their privilege. This visible marker of class was difficult to disguise or overcome, making social mobility even more challenging than it already was in medieval society, and creating a permanent physical difference between social classes that was pointed to as evidence of natural, inborn superiority rather than recognized as the product of different life circumstances and opportunities. Conclusion: the legacy of medieval beauty suffering. As we reach the end of our journey through the brutal and often shocking world of medieval beauty standards, we can see how profoundly appearance was intertwined with identity, status, morality, and worth in a society that judged bodies as reflections of souls and that enforced conformity to beauty ideals through social pressure, religious teaching, and the promise of improved marriage prospects and social opportunities. The medieval pursuit of beauty was not the frivolous vanity that it might first appear, but rather a serious matter with real consequences, where appearing beautiful could mean the difference between a good marriage and spinsterhood, between social acceptance and mockery, between being viewed as virtuous and being suspected of moral failings. The beauty practices we have explored, from the application of toxic cosmetics to the wearing of restrictive garments to the painful removal of body hair to the deliberate weakening of the body through bloodletting, reveal a society where suffering for appearance was normalized, expected, and in many cases mandatory for anyone who wished to maintain their social position or improve their circumstances. These practices were not imposed by some external tyrant, but rather were maintained by the medieval people themselves, enforced through social pressure, perpetuated by parents who trained their children in the same painful rituals they had endured, and rationalized through religious and medical theories that gave suffering a purpose and made it seem necessary and even beneficial. The women who spent hours plucking their hairlines, who rubbed lead paint onto their faces, who laced their bodies into garments that prevented breathing, were not passive victims but active participants in a system that offered them little choice, as refusing to follow beauty standards meant accepting social exclusion, reduced opportunities, and the judgment of their communities. Men too participated in this system, though generally with less extreme requirements and less severe consequences for non-compliance, but they still faced pressure to maintain appropriate appearances and to enforce beauty standards on the women in their families and social circles. The physical consequences of these beauty practices were severe and long-lasting, with many medieval people suffering from chronic pain, permanent deformity, and shortened lifespans as a result of their pursuit of beauty. The psychological consequences were equally significant, creating anxiety, shame, and a sense of inadequacy in those who could not meet the impossible standards, while those who could meet them paid a price in time, money, pain, and health. The social consequences rippled through medieval society, reinforcing class divisions, limiting opportunities for those deemed unattractive, and creating a hierarchy based partly on physical appearance that complemented and reinforced the hierarchies of birth, wealth, and power that already structured medieval life. Yet despite the suffering they caused, these beauty standards were not arbitrary or meaningless, but rather reflected deep values and beliefs about purity, status, gender, and the relationship between physical appearance and inner character. The obsession with pale skin reflected both class distinctions and religious ideas about purity and light. The emphasis on delicate, restricted bodies reinforced gender roles and class privileges. The attention to details like hand appearance made visible the invisible differences between those who worked and those who did not. And the willingness to endure pain for beauty demonstrated the strength, determination, and discipline that medieval culture valued even as it inflicted terrible costs on individuals. As you drift toward sleep with these images of medieval beauty suffering in your mind, perhaps you can reflect on how different and yet how similar our own beauty standards are, how we too pursue ideals that are often unattainable and sometimes harmful, how we too judge ourselves and others based on appearance, and how the fundamental human desire to be seen as beautiful, to conform to the standards of our time and place, to avoid the social penalties of appearing ugly or unkempt, continues to drive behaviors that range from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely dangerous. The medieval people who suffered for beauty were not so different from us, not more vain or more foolish, but rather people responding to the pressures and values of their society as we respond to ours, making choices that seemed necessary or even inevitable given the world they lived in, and paying prices that they accepted because the alternative, the social death of being marked as ugly or inappropriate, seemed even worse than the physical suffering that beauty demanded.